and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to follow a history trail. Today's history is going to take us, well, back to the old country and clear up to modern day. I'd like you to meet my guest. You are?
I'm Claudia Wagner.
And who'd you bring with you today, Claudia?
This is my husband, Orvin Edson Wagner, and we're going to kind of talk about his family a little bit this time, I think. So.
Right. And your family came to the Rogue Valley when?
1934. 1933, actually, they were here.
Well, now, how many in your family?
Just my mom and dad and Delmer and myself, Delmer Wagner.
Well, and your
Oh,
sister.
and myself.
You mentioned Delmer because people here will know that name. I've interviewed Delmer and Evelyn, your brother and sister-in-law. They had put their stake down here a long time ago and said, we can have TV here. Small town, Southern Oregon, people said, it can't happen. But it did. Now you've taught you and your brother learned electronics where?
Well, we started at home on Sykes Creek Road on our old house that now we rent out. And my mom built a house back there in about 1940.
But 1940, what was it like on Sykes Creek?
Well, there's no electricity for one thing.
Now that kind of prompts me to ask you, how did you get electricity?
Well, we had batteries. Also, we had our own little power plant that ran off our irrigation ditch that Delmer and I put in when we were kids.
Kids of what age?
We put in the irrigation ditch when we were I was about 12, and Delmer was about,
You were about 14, weren't you?
I was about 14.
Now, where did you get the idea that water could turn a wheel to create electricity to store in a battery?
Oh, probably from reading our encyclopedia and things like that.
You did have an encyclopedia.
Oh, yes. Their family actually bought their encyclopedia when they first came up here in about 1933 or 34,
I think
somewhere in
the
there.
encyclopedia was 1930, and we learned electronics from it, and I thought we were going to bring it along because electronics section is all loose pages because we used it so much.
They just about wore out that one. We kept that one volume of the encyclopedia just to show that they had used it so much that the pages had all come loose.
Well, for 12 and 14-year-old kids to be so interested in electronics, I mean, that's way before the kids were doing inventing, weren't they? No, boys have always been inventors.
Always have, you know. Well, and part of the thing too is that they were very interested in technical things from the time that they were fairly small, and but their father had been an X-ray technician, so this was some of the things too. So they were kind of introduced to the technical things. He was quite a technical person for various things in that particular time too.
Well, now let's start with his family. Your father-in-law, we're talking about.
Yes.
His
and his
name
name
is?
was Edward Benjamin Wagner, and he was orphaned when he was fairly young, but he lived with his grandparents, and his grandparents had immigrated here from Russia. They were the German immigrants from Russia, and they came over in about 1889, and they came into New York Harbor from there. And yes, you have
Just happened to have a picture of the ship. Oh, thank you, Claudia, for bringing all this. This is fantastic. This is the ship.
This was the ship. It was called the steamship, or SSMs, EMS. and they sailed out of Bremen, Germany, and came by way of Southampton, England, to New York Harbor.
And if you have any doubt that this is authentic,
This was part of the ship manifest that listed the whole family. And at the time that they came, his grandfather, Orvin's grandfather, was 13 years old. So he was actually born in South Russia, in one of the German colonies. And I did a little research on what was going on. It's a little harder to find things on his family because I don't know the stories personally. So I had to do a lot of research just checking out different things. But a lot of the Germans had immigrated from Germany into South Russia because they wanted the land, and they were invited by Catherine the Great and by her son Alexander to come in and colonize, and were given the option to form their own colony, speaking their own language, having their own religions, their own customs, everything, and did not have to serve in the military there or anything like that in Russia if they would just come and settle.
because they had expertise.
They did. They were
they were-
farmers, most of them, and they had beautiful land that they needed crops and they needed food.
And that's, I've heard of other families who were German families.
They had a lot of colonies, and it went on for quite a while, quite some time. But then they finally changed out after Catherine died and her son died. Then they started changing the rules a little bit. And they made it to the point where they were going to conscript the young men to go to the service and fight Japan. They were in a war with Japan, and so they were going to do that. And that was when there was a huge migration to the United States, and a lot of them settled in the Dakotas because there they were also given free land.
Now, you're saying this is what that's about?
No, this is the other side of the family. They've all settled, and this was a very interesting part. His mother's family and his father's family were all from the Dakotas. But they were from different parts, and they did not know each other until later years in California.
But this is such an interesting document. Where do you find such a thing?
Well, this was one that his mother had saved. This is his grandfather's land patent for a homestead in Turner, South Dakota.
18 and,
What did we say? It was 1880s
well, we know
or
who the
1890s or
governor,
something.
who the president was.
But the president was President Grover Cleveland. At the time, they were settling a lot of this area because they wanted statehood and everything for the states. And so, so his grandfather and his great-grandfather came out there and got their settled the homestead for 180 acres each, next door to each other.
Oh,
And so
that's a big spread.
It was a big spread, and they lived there and proved up on their patent and was able to get things of the land, and that's where his mother was born. Was on this particular homestead.
Did Mom ever tell you about this place that she was born? Was it a
Oh, yes.
Saudi or?
We stopped in one time to see it. Later on, she and I did.
Oh, and it was so awful because we were coming through and we found the actual homestead and the house was still there. And we got pictures of it and found out that my camera and the days of rolled film had not connected, and we did not get a single picture. And we have not found it since. We went back a couple years ago and tried to find it, but we didn't find the right place.
Well, now, what kind of place was it?
Oh, they had a nice home, a stick-built home, and
No Saudi, no dugout.
no, they were there at the time when they had actual lumber that they were able to build it with a lumber house, and but we did, and I was able to find them right away to do it.
They made brooms.
How many?
They made brooms to make a living for quite a bit. They raised broom corn and made brooms. They still make brooms out of broom corn.
But
Fascinating.
that was what their major crop was that they grew this broom corn on their acreage and then made the brooms and sold the brooms.
Now, does broom corn, is it edible?
Not that I know of.
There must
Well-
be a cob on there with seeds.
Well, actually,
Seeds might be able to eat it on the end of the, you know how the broom looks? That's, the seeds come on the end of the,
broom corn is not actually a corn. That was another thing that was interesting. It's in the sorghum family, and it has just the long tassels, the seed tassels at the very end of it, and that's what they take and tie it together to make the broom.
And dry. When it's dry,
it's
it's
dried,
brittle. I mean,
it
it's
is.
sweepable.
Yes.
look at your broom.
Yeah, take your broom at home, take a look at it, and it'll probably be made out of the broom corn. They still make those.
Well, on Father's Day out at Pottsville, that's sort of on I-5 or just off I-5, milepost maybe in 70 or thereabouts, 60. They have a broom maker there. Fascinating. Now, did they make the brooms besides hand-tied and all this?
I think they did them hand-tied, didn't they?
I
Didn't
think,
Uncle John make them in the hand-tied
I
brooms?
think they did them on the hand side.
Yeah.
Now, is Uncle John this guy?
No,
Oh.
that was another. There was a large family of them. There was Uncle John, Uncle Ed. There was
Well, you're-
Aunt Nettie.
You're named for Uncle Ed?
Well, he was named for his father, actually, because his father was Edward Benjamin, so he was Ed's son. So he is Orvin Ed's son.
Very interesting.
But there was a lot of Eds in both families, so it worked out well that way too. This was the home, was his Uncle Bertram.
He
Okay.
used to help making brooms too.
Yeah,
Now, in South Dakota,
yes,
Yeah, this is on Sykes Creek now.
yeah.
so they moved from, do you know how they came from South Dakota to Southern Oregon?
Just Uncle Bert came.
Yeah, well, your grandmother, though, she bought the property that we have up on Sykes Creek right now. She came out and purchased it. And I was very curious of finding out why they would move from their farm in South Dakota and buy some property out here. And then Uncle Bert came and built this cabin and lived out here. And then later, his mother came up here too. And we got to checking to see what was happening about this. And we realized they had become members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in the literature of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they talked about a time of trouble when they might need to flee to the hills. So they found a nice place in the hills and bought beautiful property, and they had their property. So when Uncle Bert decided he wanted to move away from home, he came out to the property out here in Oregon. And his parents they were going to school down in Southern California, and when they finished their schooling, they decided to come back up to Southern Oregon also.
Aha. And leave the South Dakota roots.
Yes.
You know, the story is wonderful because education's always been important in your family. Is that right?
That's correct.
Absolutely.
And yet you live so far from any school, but you had, after the tragedy, we'll talk a little bit about the tragedy, but Mom,
She became a school teacher. And we had from the family, education was always important. His mother was taking nursing training down at White Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles, and that was where she met his father, who was studying to be an X-ray technician. And so-
romance.
Yeah, so she didn't finish her nurse's training. She got her MRS degree instead of her nursing degree, but so education was important. They had gone through she had gone through Plainview Academy back in the Dakotas, and then he had moved out to California, out to Lodi, California, and he had attended Lodi Academy there, and his father had.
And they got together.
And they got together there, and this was his parents, Mary
Okay.
Esther Wagner and Edward Benjamin Wagner. So they
Very proper. And
Yes.
then they moved to Southern Oregon.
yes, yeah, after he and Delmer had been born, They were both born in Los Angeles, and then they moved up here.
You know, my folks came from Glendale, California, all the way up to Grants Pass. And then that's what the beginnings, 1930, for my family, 1933.
Can I make a comment here?
Please.
Mrs. White advised people to move out of the cities, you know. That was why they moved to Oregon.
Well, Oregon's been good for you.
It has
Because just to jump way ahead, your education, you are an educator. For that matter, you're an educator.
Yes.
So let's get that out here and let people know. They may have taught you from in high school or in college or at the university. You did them all.
Mm-hmm. So we've, like I say, education and learning things has always been very important. And like I say, in his family, from the early days and from his family, well, and actually one of his aunts was one of the very few women doctors in the early days also. His Aunt Laura became a doctor.
My mother's sister.
His mother's sister. And so
Laura's last name?
Laura Miller. And she was a doctor at College Place, Washington for quite a few years. So education was very important to all of them.
Let's get back to this tragedy that happened in the family, because I can hardly imagine. There must have been a knock on the door that so many people. Dad was working in Ashland?
At the time, Orvin was in first grade over at Rogue River Academy, and so they were living over around in the Griffin Creek area of Medford, but his dad had a job at the Ashland Hospital, and so as an X-ray technician, and so he was spending the weeks in Ashland and would come home on the weekends.
And how did he come home?
Did he get a ride home, or did he?
Had a car.
He did have a car, but he just didn't use it very much. So while he was in Ashland, he rode a bicycle most of the time, and he was riding up Mountain Avenue, which is still in Ashland, right by the university now, and a student in a car was going a little too fast and came through the intersection and hit him and knocked him off his bicycle, and so he died about 2 hours later in the hospital.
He died the next morning.
How did you learn about this?
Well, somebody called us. I know the police took Delmer and I in a car traveling 95 miles an hour or so. I remember when that was impressed on my being a young kid, how fast they were driving, taking us to my dad's location in Ashland.
Yeah.
As he was in the hospital.
Yes.
And did you know at that time he was not expected to live?
We didn't know what the story was quite when they took us to the hospital.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that can relate to your story, because, you know, when we go to the hospital, we don't know what to expect. And your father, from the injuries that had happened,
Had a crushed chest.
Mm-hmm.
and of course, there's life just waned.
Mm-hmm.
And
It lasted overnight.
then there you were, the eldest son with a widowed mother. And were there now 2 little kids?
Yes, yes.
If Delmer was a little kid, his
Well,
sister would be.
His sister she was about 8 years younger than Orvin. So she was just about 18 months old or something like that when this happened.
Heartbreak, just heartbreak when something like this happens.
Right. And this was tough times, always tough times. And, but yet Mother, needed to take care of her family. And
No Social Security, no handouts from.
no, at one point she said, I was down, I was really absolutely broke. I had no money. And she said, I had to borrow $20 from my mother. And she said, but I paid her back. She was very insistent that she did
Well, she
that.
didn't want to accept $40 a month pension that they offered to people, to widows back then, because she didn't want government support.
Oh,
Right.
really?
And she said for a little while that she had helped or had taken some surplus food type things, but she said no. She said it just hurt her pride. She just didn't do it. She could do it on her own, and she did.
Well, what did she do? She hadn't finished college.
No, right after his father was killed, they went up to Walla Walla, or College Place, Washington, and stayed for a while with his sister, or with her sister, Aunt Laura. Aunt Laura, that was the doctor. And his mother took some correspondence courses to be able to teach. But at that time, teachers were not really required to have certificates that much.
No PhD necessary, no
No
master's
master's
degree.
degree necessary. As a matter of fact, she actually had worked a little bit in 1933 because we had just a part of a contract with the conference to allow her to teach elementary school to the best of her ability with no certificate. And she was to teach
Sort of like a conditional permit.
Yes, it
right?
was, yeah. And so then later she got the qualifications then to do the, she got her certificate mostly through the mail to do that.
You know, women have long found a way to feed their children, feed their family after such a tragedy. Did your mother talk about your dad to you as a child?
Oh, yes.
What did she tell you about him?
She loved him.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And he was a good teacher. He was a good X-ray technician.
He was a good X-ray technician, right.
And he was also a very good musician. He had a very good voice. He loved to sing and had taken vocal lessons. And Mother played the piano. She was also played piano for church. She gave lessons also. And that was another thing that helped her income, was giving piano lessons to students in the area. And
Now, how did she didn't have a car.
Oh, we used, quite a while, I had a great uncle that lived up the creek from us, and he had a car, so we went to town with him. For quite a while, we didn't have a car for quite a long time, and we went to town with her. This great uncle of mine married an aunt of her sister.
married Mother's sister. And so they lived up, so they had family that stayed together even then, pretty much, because Uncle Bert was there. Now, Uncle Bert didn't own a car at all either, did he?
Oh, he had a car.
Oh,
yeah.
he had a car, but he liked to walk. And he would walk sometimes from our Sykes Creek home over where he lives now, or where we live now, and he would walk all the way over to their home in Medford.
Oh my!
So-
now you have a picture of the Sykes Creek house,
Yes.
That's Uncle Bert's old cabin.
and this is your. That's the way they.
That was,
This is a shed.
Woodshed.
it was just a little woodshed that was out there. That was the cabin that Uncle Bert built. He did build, right.
Yeah, he built
He
it.
built that cabin, and he lived in it. And then this was after he had passed away, and they had moved up there. They took a picture of it before we'd done any remodeling on this thing, before it became our house. But our
So
house,
you're living in a house that is almost 100 years old.
Almost energy, what?
almost 100 years old? No, I don't think it was quite, would it be?
Well, of course,
Would it be 100 years old?
we modified it in 1973. My uncle had died
But when would Uncle Bert have built that house? Do you
about
remember?
1941 or something.
About 1941, okay.
Okay.
So-
Well, it's not what you'd call a housing tract house. It's not quite the same.
No, it was,
Well, it doesn't look the
Okay.
same now. We included it in our house we have now.
That is fun. That's
Yeah.
fun. You know, I'm so proud of your family. I just could squeak. Who's Benjamin?
Benjamin was his grandfather. That was just that was one of the things that came along that I found with the ship that he was on. It tells a little bit about the ship that they came over on from when they came over from Russia, because this was his grandfather that came
Okay.
over.
Now, you are a research, is
I-
that the teacher in you?
It is.
And where did you get this?
I went on the computer.
Oh, computers.
Computers are absolutely wonderful because you can find very many different things on them. I also do a lot of my research at the Family Research Genealogy Center here in town, so I go down there quite often. And
That's a part of the Mormon
that is part,
church.
yes.
In almost any place, any
Yes.
town where you folks live and want to do about family research.
Yes, and they are very, very, very cooperative to help you find anything about your family, and they have access to it, to a lot of different sources that sometimes everybody else does not have.
Now, is there a fee for that?
There is, the only thing you pay is the printing cost.
it-
So like 5 cents or 25 cents, I think it is, a page or something like that, which is very, very well worth it.
Now, is this all on the computer?
I found almost all of this on the computer, and I'm printing them up, trying to do a booklet on his family like I've done on my family, and getting that ready to go. So we're hoping that we can continue to do this.
Folks, now you can see why I wanted to talk more and more about the work she's done and how the Wagner family comes into your story. This is fascinating, and I want to thank you so much for coming. But let's move on in another time and find out, bringing us up to date.
All right. That's good.
Thank you very much for being my guest.
You're welcome.
I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying thanks for traveling with us way back to the 1930s in the Rogue Valley. I guess you call it the Rogue Valley, but it's
Sure. Evans Valley, at least.
Evans Valley. That's the right name for it. Folks, look it up on your computer. It's fascinating. It still kind of looks the way it did with the covered bridge.
Still.
I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying thank you so much for tuning in.